When you're writing a reflective journal, try to be spontaneous. It's the way you handle it. If you go to the task like, oh, here I go, I've got to do this, it won't be any good. When you reflect on anything in your life and your work, you need to be willing to reflect. So be spontaneous. Don't edit yourself. If you're writing as a personal entry to yourself and you're reflecting over something that's very hard for you to assimilate, use the language you would use if you were talking to a friend. In this case, your friend is the journal. So you pour out what it is that you're concerned about. So it doesn't matter what field you're in, because every field has issues, and there's always practice that could be better. So what you're trying to do in a journal is to go blah and put it out. Now the blah, if it's not systematic, will be a mess of thoughts that don't necessarily become coherent. What you need to do is have questions that guide your reflection. Now it depends which reflective practice area you're working in. So I'm in healthcare, for instance, and so basically the questions relate to what was happening, with whom, how, when, where, and how did you really feel. These questions will create the context for what you're writing about and give you a thick description of the problem. When you get to the how you really feel, some of the words you use in your journal will not see the light of day because they're not considered appropriate in tertiary settings. In other words, if you are really down and absolutely bereft about something and you're using adjectives that don't fit an academic essay, that's okay in your journal. What comes forward, if it's created as an assessment, are words that will encapsulate that emotion without quite the directness you gave it when you were just writing to yourself. But I think we've got to be very clear about reflection on your practice as a sole responsibility versus reflection on your practice that's transposed into an academic exercise. The academic exercise will probably ask you for references and research and everything else. But if you are reflecting to improve your practice in whatever field you're in, your own thoughts and your own ability to learn from your questioning systematic process should be sufficient in that instance. For a question to be focused and systematic, it needs to have some depth. When you're working in organisations as an employee, say, every organisation has its shadow side. And by shadow side, I mean the practices that you think are not quite up to standard. They may be morally questionable, they may have some sort of organisational issues there, and you're feeling at ill at ease. Now, the thing about reflection is you start to get to the nub of an issue when you work out what is operating against my value system. So really what it is, it's about saying, if I have these rules for living about telling the truth, being honest, being friendly, whatever it is, and I go into an organisation and I'm not seeing it practiced, that will run up against my value system and make me uncomfortable. In terms of reflecting on it, it's not just about what doesn't suit you morally, it's about what are the constraints operating in this organisation that make it the way it is. In other words, don't blame the victim. A lot of organisations have been around for a long time and they haven't had any means of looking into their own practices to determine whether or not they're even reasonable. When you're looking into an organisation to try to work out where do you stand in terms of that organisation's philosophy, you will ask yourself questions around what are the constraints operating in this situation? What are the political, historical, personal, economic constraints that cause this organisation to behave the way it does? And when you do that, you realise that there are many variables operating in any setting. Reflection's not about finding the right answer. There are no right answers. Reflection's about finding the answer that works best in this moment, for this time, with this people, in this place. And if you remember that, you'll never be arrogant enough to assume that a life of reflection will make you a guru. It won't do that. It'll just make you more aware of things that can go wrong and options you can take in order to make it more in line with what you're happy to live with.